So I gave this talk the other day and I meant to record it live, but we had some technical problems, so I wasn't able to. Can you hear that bird? I wasn't able to record it live because of technical problems, but I think it's a really important one, so I recorded it at home last night. It's about what we can do in our gardens to support wildlife and why it's so important that we do. So here it is. This is Gardening for a Better Future. Enjoy. Today I want to show you why our gardens are so important in protecting and restoring biodiversity to our planet. For far too long, our gardens have been overlooked by developers, by policymakers, by ecologists, and most importantly of all, by us, gardeners. But the potential our gardens have to provide a home for, to nourish, and to connect wildlife across our landscape is extraordinary. And by the end of this talk, I want you to not only be able to see that more clearly, but to have some new ideas that you can take home to unlock that potential in your own garden. But I need to begin by giving you some context. Now, the figures I'm about to show you are somewhat depressing, but there's a lot to be hopeful for, so stick with me. Okay, 189th. That's where we are in the world as a nation for nature intactness. Interestingly, we're number 6 in the world for wealth, so it just goes to show that money can't buy everything. But what does that really mean? How does it translate to the real world? Well, we have to start by looking at our ecosystems. Our rivers, for example. Only 16% of the rivers in England meet good ecological status. Now, in my home village of Wickhambrew, we have a beautiful chalk stream that flows through it, the Little Stour, and although it looks beautiful, it's one of the vast majority which is polluted. Now, since the 1930s, we've lost almost all of our wildflower meadows, 97% gone. Now, these meadows are just about the most vibrant, the most biodiverse ecosystems that we have. And with such a loss of wildflower meadows, it's no surprise that over half of our wildflower populations have disappeared since the 70s. Now, these wildflowers, these plants, are so important. They're what we call autotrophs, which means that they're the only ones that can harness the sun's energy and make it available to the rest of the food chain. And this may be why we've seen such a loss of pollinating insects, down 18%. So that's bees, butterflies, hoverflies, moths, and so much more. And we've seen a loss of predatory insects, down 34%. Now, these predators are very important for lots of reasons, but especially for us humans. They provide us with pest control in our agricultural crops and in our garden plants. And we see the development of what we call a feedback loop here. It works like this. So the predators help to control pests in our agricultural crops and our garden plants. But with less predators, we end up with more pests, and that means that gardeners and farmers tend to use more pesticides. Now, these pesticides don't just kill pests, they also kill the predators. So we end up with even less predators and even more pests, and we use more pesticides, which means we have even less predators and more pests and more pesticides, and the problem amplifies. That's the feedback loop. Now, some groups of insects have been hit much harder than others, in particular ones which have very specific host plants, ones which have limited mobility, and ones which are very prone to pesticide damage. And this is probably why we've seen such a loss of butterfly numbers, down 80% since the 70s. That's an incredible reduction. Now, with such a loss of insects in general, we see a knock-on effect further up the food chain. So insectivorous bird numbers are down. Swifts, for example, down 68%, house martins 42% down, spotted flycatchers 67%. These are big losses. And when it comes to our farmland birds, such as the yellowhammer here, we see a reduction of 58%, again since the 70s. Now, the worst hit of the farmland birds is the turtle dove, down 98%. Incredible reduction. It's really, really bad news. I've never seen a turtle dove in my life. That shows how rare they are, because I do spend a lot of time in farmland. So when we look at our native bird species as a whole, we see that 43% of them are facing extinction. And when it comes to our native mammals, that's around 25% facing the same fate. So we started by looking at the base of the ecosystem, the plants. And what we see is that when we pull that base away from the ecosystem, everything else comes toppling down on top. But why? What could possibly cause so much destruction? What could cause destruction on such a massive scale? Climate change? Pesticides? Microplastics? Well, these all play a role, but the real cause, the big one, is staring us straight in the face, if we know where to look. This is my home village of Wickenbrew. Now, when my wife Amy and I put an offer on our house, we came back the same evening to have a look around to see if it was rowdy. It wasn't. It was actually really quiet, and we walked around for about an hour and a half and didn't see a single other person. But we did see a lot of wildlife. We saw a barn owl hunting in this field over here. We saw badgers just off the side of the map. We saw eels in the river and pipistrelles hunting on the village green, and we even saw stag beetles down this road over here. It was amazing. We love wildlife, and we fell in love with the village straight away. We knew we had to move here. But this picture isn't representative of our country as a whole. It's not until we approach our village from the sky that the source of our problem becomes more obvious. Now, each of these 4 videos approaches our village from a different direction. And when I first recorded these, when I first saw our home from this angle, I was really shocked. I've known for years and years about the extent of agriculture in our country, but to see it from this angle, to see it enclosing us in this way, it's kind of like we're in a cage. We are an oasis in a desert of monoculture and bare ground. I use the word monoculture. This is what monoculture looks like close up. Field after field of the same few plants, whether it's grazing land or monoculture cropland such as this maize field. Each plant is genetically almost identical to the one next to it. There's nothing here for wildlife, it doesn't produce nectar because it's wind pollinated, and copious amounts of fertiliser and pesticide are sprayed regularly throughout the growing season. Combined with regular ploughing, this leads to soil that I would describe as dead. Now you might be asking, is Wickenbrew in a particularly bad position? It's not really, this is fairly typical for our country. In fact, if we look at our country as a whole, we see that around 70% of it is taken up by farmland. Now, we need farmland, it's essential, this is where we get our food from. And I'm not having a go at farmers or farming, I love farming, it's a bit of a passion of mine. But, at the same time, we need to recognise that farming is the number 1 cause of land use, it's the number 1 cause of wildlife loss and species extinction, it's the number 1 cause of water pollution, of soil degradation, of deforestation, and it's for this reason that people like George Monbiot have described food production as the worst thing we've ever done to the planet. But let's look at this from the perspective of a wild animal. Imagine you're a bird or a flying insect flying over our landscape. Where do you land? In the bare fields? Well, you could walk through them all day long and not see so much as a tick. Definitely nothing to eat. No protection from predators either. No protection from the elements. On a polytunnel? Don't think so. What about here? Okay, let's have a closer look. So this is a garden. So I can see a hedge running down one side, and that means protection from the elements. It might mean a food source. It might mean finding a mate. So we look a bit closer. Now that's a flower bed, and as we know, flowers and plants form the base of the ecosystem. So they mean life, and we land. Now when an animal enters a well cared for garden, they're greeted by a functioning ecosystem. A small one, but an ecosystem nonetheless. They find a great diversity of plants, all harnessing energy from the sun and feeding pollinating insects and herbivores. Now some gardeners would call these herbivores pests, but to many animals they're a lifeline. They find predatory insects like damselflies, dragonflies and spiders that carry the sun's energy further up the food chain. And even insects like wasps, which are often considered a nuisance, have important roles to play in this complex ecosystem. Visiting animals will likely find some of their own species, which they may be able to breed with, and who knows what they might find after dark. Slugs and snails could be a valuable food source, but foxes might be looking for something to eat too. Now, I don't expect you to know who Jennifer Owen was, but let me tell you she was utterly brilliant. She said, "Gardens are extraordinarily rich habitats," and I say the few statements have ever been said so simply and proven so thoroughly. Jennifer moved to her 4-bedroom suburban house in Leicester in 1972 and, being a zoologist, decided to see what wildlife species she could find living in her garden. Now, after getting off to a promising start, she decided to continue recording everything she could for the next 30 years. Over a 30-year period, she found 474 plant species, 64 species of vertebrates, 1,997 insect species, 138 other invertebrates, and of all of these species that she found, 7 had never been found in Britain before. In total, over a 30-year period, she found 2,673 species in her small suburban garden. She said there's nothing special about my garden in Leicester, and that most gardens must harbour as diverse a fauna. In other words, all she did was start looking. She went on to say that gardens are probably richer than any natural habitat of comparable area. Now, no doubt inspired by Jennifer's amazing work, Sheffield University went on to start the BUGS project, Biodiversity in Urban Gardens Sheffield. A really cool name, I know. And over a much shorter time period, only 6 years, they found over 2,000 species of plant and animal living in urban gardens. Now this is where it gets really exciting. Combined, England's gardens cover an area around 3 times bigger than the Lake District. We have a national park we never knew we had, and it's the biggest of the lot by far. Now, as it stands, this new nature reserve is fragmented. In other words, the gardens that are optimised for wildlife are few and far between, and when ecosystems become fragmented, they become fragile. But if we can learn a few simple actions that support wildlife in our gardens, if we can adjust our approach to gardening as a nation, I believe that we gardeners can make a real difference. Something else I believe is that gardening is a lot simpler than it's made out to be. I don't think we need to worry too much about learning things like pruning groups or perfecting colour schemes. We can learn these things in time if we want to, but they're not really that important. I believe that the 5 actions I'm going to show you now are more important than anything else. This is what we need to focus on. These are the things we need to master before we go any further down the garden path. Let's start with action 1, wilding our gardens. Now, this is a really powerful action because the wildlife that we're trying to support evolved in our wild landscapes. So recreating part of this in our gardens provides food, protection, nesting opportunities, and a lot more. And the great news is that wilding is a whole load easier now than it used to be. For a long time it was thought that the UK's natural state was dense woodland. It's been said that a squirrel could have run from Land's End to John O'Groats without touching the ground. In other words, just by climbing through the canopies of the trees. That is now doubtful. Biologist and conservationist Franz Vera suggests our natural landscape, while still containing a lot of trees, would have been much more open, with enough light reaching the ground to support grass, floral diversity, and large herbivores. So I photoshopped some long grass and bison onto our village green to give you an idea of what our landscape might have looked like 8,000 years ago. I know that's a bit of a silly thing to do, but the reason I did it is because when I look at our village green, I see that it's not a million miles away from what Franz Vera described. It's got big trees, small trees, it has grass. Like I said, rewilding just got a lot easier because in some places we're already halfway there. Now, large trees like the ones in our village green don't work well in small gardens, solely from a human perspective. Wildlife would love them. But they can upset neighbours, and they take time to regrow, so if a tenant moves in and cuts it down, you're back to square one. But the grass that grows underneath the trees, the meadows, do really well in gardens. They're very easy to establish, and maintaining them only takes 2 steps, which you repeat each year. The first step is to find an area of lawn that you don't necessarily need as lawn, and to stop cutting it. So you stop cutting it in March, and you let it grow long all summer. When it comes to late summer, you cut the grass down and remove it. You normally do this at the end of July or beginning of August. Now, removing the grass removes excess nutrient from the soil and enables wildflowers to compete with the grass. So even though you haven't sown or planted any wildflowers, they will find their way into your garden. Now, that's not to say that you can't sow wildflowers, you definitely can, and this will speed up the establishment of your new wildflower meadow. But I'm all about saving money and making great gardens accessible to everyone, so I'm saying that you don't need to if you don't want to. And to back that up, I want to show you our home meadow where we haven't sown any wildflower seed. So this was our lawn on the day that we moved in. A lawn like any other, nothing special, with a few weeds. Now, I'm only cutting a pathway so we can walk through the meadow and enjoy it, nothing else. So many of those weeds that I mentioned are actually beautiful plants. So even in the first year, we got a great display of wildflowers. And that has grown each year to include fox and cubs, this red flower here, love in a mist, which grows on the edge of the meadow, salad burnet, which just arrived this year, just turned up out of nowhere. The seed must have landed and started to grow. Knapweed, which again just turned up this year for the first time. And loads of field scabious. We started off with one plant which just happened to be there, and that's grown to cover about half of the meadow. So these wildflowers that have found their own way into the meadow attract pollinating insects like bees, butterflies, hoverflies and moths, as well as herbivorous insects, which again many people call pests, but which are very welcome in our garden because we know that every organism has its part to play in our ecosystem. Further up the food chain, we had lots of predatory insects like damselflies and spiders, and these all bring the sun's energy further and further up the food chain until it reaches the apex predators. Now, wildflower meadows are probably the easiest form of garden wilding, and it works well in most gardens, but there are other natural habitats that we can mimic depending on our garden size and our garden setting. For example, ponds and wetland gardens would probably work very well in Stodmarsh and Marshside, two villages near us which, by their name, are very marshy, very good for wetland gardens. And if you have a particularly big garden, you could look to create an open canopy woodland to mimic that natural landscape that Franz Vera described. And actually, I've got a client who's got a big garden, and for the last 25 years he's been doing this, and it's such an amazing garden. It's full of meadows and big trees and wildlife. It's amazing. Now, unless you have a very small garden, in which case I would understand why you might not want to do this, I would recommend making a very significant part of your garden more wild, because it's not only great for wildlife, it's also a whole load easier to maintain than almost any other garden feature. And that means less time working in your garden, and more time relaxing in your garden, enjoying that wildlife haven that you've created. Now, at this stage, you might be thinking, but I like my flower beds. Don't worry, I've got an answer for that, and it's called naturalistic planting. So naturalistic planting seeks to mimic and even enhance the beauty of nature, but it retains many of those wildlife promoting aspects. This man is a bit of a hero of mine. He's called Pete Udolph, and he's been described as the father of naturalistic planting, or a visionary. What he did was he transformed the style into a worldwide movement. In doing so, he shifted the focus from plants to landscapes and blended art with ecology. But what does naturalistic planting actually look like? Well, let's take a look at the new naturalistic planting at RHS Wisley, designed by the man himself, Pete Udolph. So, like I said, the focus is very much on the landscape as opposed to individual plants. Now, that's not to say that there aren't some very special plants here, and you can definitely take time to appreciate individual specimens as you enjoy the garden, but it's called naturalistic planting because we're trying to bring a natural environment into our garden. And it's the environment as a whole which is going to support wildlife, build soil health, and nurture our connection with nature. And just like in the natural environment, diversity is key. And in this small area alone, I count at least 15 different species of plant. So that gives you an idea about the degree of diversity that we're trying to achieve. Now, where traditional gardens depend on brief bursts of blousy flowers, naturalistic planting provides beauty that carries through the year. So architecture and form are often prioritised over showy flowers. This not only provides beauty over a longer time frame, it also gives hiding places and food sources for wildlife in the form of hollow stems and seed heads. To build on this idea of form and architecture, I once heard Pete Udolph say that you should be able to take a photo of a border or a planting plan in black and white, and it should look as beautiful as it would in colour. So here's the test. This is a beautiful combination of sea holly and moorgrass in colour, and I'm going to turn it to black and white. What do you think? Does it pass the test? I think it does. I think it still looks amazing. I love the spiky texture of the sea holly in its upright form, and I love the combination with the lacy leaves of the moorgrass. So I think it works. Now, a friend of mine who's a garden designer once told me that Pete Udolph's naturalistic style doesn't work especially well in small gardens. But I beg to differ. So let's have a look at some naturalistic planting in our small home garden. Now, instead of using large blocks or groups of plants, in small gardens I like to use small blocks interspersed with individual plants. This enables you to keep that wild feel while still having a great amount of diversity. If we use large blocks like they have at Wisley, we'd only be able to fit a few different types of plant in our much smaller home gardens. This method of planting helps to create planting schemes that look a lot like a natural habitat, albeit a visually enhanced version, perfect for people that want their garden to look amazing all year round. Now this picture shows an area between blocks where we have a range of individual plants mixed together. This is what we call the matrix, and it's one of my favourite parts of this style, when you see all those different forms blending together like they might in the wild. So a few more shots that show the diversity that you can achieve even in a small garden bed by planting in this way. And this diversity not only looks beautiful, it also ensures that there's always something for pollinating insects to enjoy feeding upon. And these airy plants, and by that I mean plants you can see through due to their wiry stems and lack of leaves high up, give insects very easy access to the flowers. And again, choosing plants that have attractive form is so important if you want to enjoy your garden both long before and long after it's finished flowering. This small-flowered foxglove, Digitalis parviflora on the right, is one of my favourite plants, and it's always completely covered by bees because it's got so much nectar. And again, because of the form of the flower spike, it looks great both before and after flowering. But how do you get started with naturalistic planting? Well, I like to keep it simple. If you can learn the 4 Ds, you'll have everything that you need to get started. They are dense, diverse, durable, and dies beautifully. And we'll start with dense. Okay, so planting densely or encouraging dense growth is essential in any garden. But how dense is dense enough? Well, I like to say that if you can see the soil, it's not dense enough. You need more plants. But why is soil coverage so important? Well, plants capture the sun's energy through photosynthesis, and they turn it into chemical energy, in other words, sugars and starches. But they release 10 to 40% of these sugars into the soil to feed soil life, which in return makes plant growth possible by providing plants with nutrients, with water, and with protection from pests and diseases. This may be why soil scientists like Robert Blakemore describe the soil food web in tandem with plants as a foundation for all terrestrial life on Earth. But as well as feeding the soil, dense plant growth protects the soil from compaction caused by rainfall. If you imagine, when rain falls from the sky, it falls from really high up, and by the time it hits the ground, it's falling at maybe 8 or 9 meters per second, and all those drops, one after the other, tap, 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 cause soil compaction. But if we cover the soil with plants, rather than falling from all that distance, the raindrops hit the leaves and gently fall to the soil surface, and this prevents compaction from forming. Just as important is the role of plant roots in building soil structure and preventing soil erosion. Now you might not have heard of soil erosion before, so I'm going to show you what it looks like. So this is an agricultural area in Germany, and you can see this field is being used to grow annual cereal crops which normally have very shallow roots. Now this photo was taken a few weeks or maybe a few months before a heavy rainstorm. It's just to show you what it looked like before the rainstorm. So this is what it looked like after the rainstorm. Now, when we strip plants from the land, or when we grow very shallow-rooted plants like the annual cereal crops, and when we treat our soil like Play-Doh rather than the planet's most important ecosystem, this is what happens. This is soil erosion. And with extreme weather events on the rise, we're going to see a lot more scenes like this if we don't take better care of our soil. Okay, number 2, diversity. So, by having a diverse range of plant species from a range of plant families, we give homes and food sources to a wide range of wildlife species. And that includes soil life because remember, soil life gets its energy from plants too. And when we promote diversity in an ecosystem, we build resilience. Now the link between ecosystem diversity and resilience is well established, and I like this quote from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which says, "Greater biodiversity increases the resilience of ecosystems, making them less vulnerable to shocks and disturbances, and better able to supply humans with needed services." So let's do this for the wildlife, but even if we don't do it for the wildlife, let's at least do it for ourselves. Okay, durable. This is a really important one. Our garden plants need to be tough. We need to be able to rely on them to come back year after year. This saves us time, it saves us money and energy that we would otherwise spend on sourcing, buying and replanting plants. Our plants also look a lot better for longer in the year if they're durable because they're not being constantly attacked by pests and diseases. Now the classic example of this is the hosta, which always gets eaten by slugs and snails. Now I've completely stopped growing plants which I can't rely upon because it's just not worth the effort. Okay, the last one is dies beautifully or bountifully. So if we choose the right plants and treat them well, our gardens can look great all year round, even in the middle of winter. We shouldn't start cutting our herbaceous plants down to the ground until late February because not only can they look beautiful in winter, they can also provide a vital food source and protection for a whole load of wildlife species, such as these two little cute ladybirds, which I photographed the other day getting ready for winter by finding a home in this Himalayan honeysuckle. It's like a hollow node. So, if we allow these homes to develop in our garden, wildlife will find them and they will move in. Now, if you want to get an idea of which plants do well in a naturalistic garden, check out my website where I frequently post videos to give plant ideas. And I'm also working on some planting plan examples which you can use as inspiration when planting in your own garden. They're not quite there yet, but I'll be putting them up. Okay, action 3. I find this one really exciting. It's called Artificial Homes for Wildlife. And when I talk about this one, I often get a response that goes something like this. Oh no, we shouldn't be making artificial homes for wildlife. If they can't survive on their own, then surely their time has come. But we need to remember why we're doing this. It's not because these organisms are weak and can't hack it in the wild. It's because agricultural expansion and intensification has destroyed many of their homes and nesting sites. Let me show you some examples. Let's look at hedgerows. So since the early 1900s, we've lost around half of our hedgerows. This is largely due to agricultural intensification, making fields bigger so they're easier to work with big machinery. If you want to make a field bigger, you remove hedgerows. But these hedgerows, they're artificial homes in their own right. Many were planted over 200 years ago, with some dating back to around 1,000 years, but they were planted by humans, they're artificial. And for all of that time, they've provided the perfect artificial home for a whole load of different wildlife species, providing food, shelter, nesting opportunities, and a lot more. So their loss is dearly missed by many. But what can we do in our gardens? Well, in gardens, we're often faced with a choice between fences and hedges, and let's face it, fences usually win because of convenience. They can be built in one day, they have a narrower footprint so they don't take up very much room in your garden, and you don't need to cut them each year. But there are a lot of negatives to fences too. For example, they often block wildlife corridors, stopping wildlife from moving from one area to the next. They don't provide food, they don't provide nesting or shelter opportunities, and if you have a solid fence, when strong wind hits it, it's forced over and it can cause turbulence on the other side, causing damage to your garden, to plants, to wildlife habitats, to structures and so on. Now hedges are pretty much the complete opposite. They allow animals to pass through from one area to the next. They can provide food in the form of berries, flowers and tasty leaves. They offer excellent nesting opportunities, and rather than forcing the air over the top, they diffuse the air, creating a calm shelter on the leeward side. Now, if you're going to plant a hedge, I would strongly recommend that you consider planting a mixed species wildlife hedge, as this supports the widest range of wildlife species. Look for native plants with lots of flowers, lots of fruit and thorns. Now, I say native because native plants tend to do things at the right time for our native wildlife. And here are a few great examples. Hawthorn is often considered the gold standard because it has everything. It has flowers, berries, thorns and tasty leaves. But it's really important to have diversity, because all of these species provide something different and at a different time of the year. It's also important to consider how we look after our hedges. We have a habit of cutting our hedges every year in summer to keep them tidy. But it's much better to wait until late winter when the berries have all been eaten, and to cut our hedges every 2 to 3 years if possible, as many of these species only flower on older wood. And remember that hedges don't only work on the boundary of your garden, they work amazingly well as soft, wildlife-friendly boundaries within your garden. Sticking with homes for wildlife, let's look at the specific case of the barn owl. Now, barn owls naturally nest in places like tree hollows, but as our country was deforested and farm buildings started popping up, they shifted, quite happily, to nesting in suitable buildings. Unfortunately, while almost half of traditional farm buildings were suitable for barn owls to nest in, only around 4% of modern farm buildings are unless a nest box is provided. Now, thankfully, the Barn Owl Trust has a really good website where they give great instructions on building your own barn owl nest box. Now, I'm not saying that we should all build barn owl nest boxes. I mean, they should work well in our area because we've had barn owls in our area recently, we've got suitable hunting grounds, and we know that some of the trees which had nest boxes in have been cut down. But what I am saying is that if you know you have a specific species in your area that could do with a little extra help, it's worth looking up to see what you can do to help that specific species. Let's look at bees for a moment. So bees are really, really important, as I'm sure you know. One study in 2016 suggested that they pollinated up to $577 billion worth of food crops each year, which is cool but also kind of a moot point as others question whether we could even survive without them. Unfortunately, around a third of our native bee species are in decline. Now, the good news is that the honeybee, which gets most of our attention, isn't one of them. They're actually up 45% since the 1960s, which may be why Professor Jeff Ollerton said, "Keeping hives to save bees is like keeping chickens to save birds." In fact, honeybees may cause more harm to wild bee numbers by outcompeting them for nectar and pollen, and by spreading diseases like deformed wing virus. But in tandem with growing lots of flowering plants in our naturalistic borders and our wildflower meadows, I think there's something we can do to help bees. Bee B&Bs or bee hotels. Now, I was really inspired by these examples at the Cherry Orchard Community Nature Reserve in Littlebourne, which is the next village along from us. They were built with the children from the village school, and when I visited in summer, there was a constant stream of solitary bees going in and out. They're really easy to make. They're essentially a box with one side that's open. The box is about 15 centimetres deep and it's stuffed with bamboo canes, and this provides a perfect nesting opportunity. Now, this is another type of bee hotel. It's basically just a log with the holes drilled into it. Okay, around 2,000 of our native invertebrates are saproxylic. Do you know what that means? It means that they're reliant on deadwood to complete their life cycle. But we gardeners have a habit of removing deadwood from our gardens because it looks messy. Now, I think we can change our mindset on this dramatically. I think we can start seeing deadwood as something beautiful, something that's full of life. Now, two things that I absolutely love are log piles and brash piles. I'm a bit weird like that. But I want to show you a log pile that I built in our garden when we first moved in. So we inherited this beautiful cherry tree with our garden. Now, the issue is it had double flowers which don't feed pollinating insects. They don't have nectar or pollen. And it was very big for our small back garden. But rather than cutting it down and getting rid of it, we cut it down and let it stay where it was, and we planted around it, and that was the log pile. Now, after 3 years, it can just be seen poking out from the vegetation that covers it, which is a really good thing because we want deadwood, but we also want lots of living things growing around it. That's a hazel tree that's growing in place of the old cherry tree, which is great for wildlife. And the wood of the cherry tree is just starting to rot, and it will probably continue to do so for many years to come, and I would love it if in time it became a home for species like stag beetles, which we know are found in Wickenbrew, but which are threatened. Okay, I want to touch very briefly on ponds. So ponds can support up to 2/3 of all our freshwater species, and interestingly, it doesn't matter if they're natural or if they're man-made. Perhaps even more important is their role as stepping stones connecting aquatic environments across our landscape. Now, I want to tell you a quick story. So, a couple of years ago, I made a little wildlife pond in our front garden, and I woke up early the next morning and I filled it with tap water. So at this stage, it's just a hole with a liner and tap water in, and then I went off to work. About 2 or 3 hours later, I got a text with a picture from my wife of our wildlife pond, and I zoomed in, and no word of a lie, there was a grey wagtail there. Now, grey wagtails, if you don't know, are strongly associated with aquatic environments, where they walk along the edge of the aquatic environment and forage for aquatic insects. I have no idea how certain aquatic organisms find water so quickly, but I'm amazed by it. And what I would say is that if you have any space in your garden that you could potentially make a small pond, do it. Even if it's only a small, like a washing up bowl sunk into the ground with a few plants in it, it's really worth doing. Okay, harnessing natural resources. This is so important and it completely transforms what's possible in our gardens. As an example, plants and mulch are our two biggest assets for improving soil health. Remember that plants bring solar energy into the soil and they give it structure. But here's the thing, they cost more than most gardeners can afford. To put this into perspective, mulching a 25 metre squared bed costs around £220, and I do recommend mulching every year. This is how we mimic nature. This is how we mimic leaves falling to the ground in autumn, and it's how we mimic herbaceous plants toppling over onto the ground. This is how we support the organisms that bring organic matter down from the soil surface into the soil profile. So I'm going to show you a really easy and effective way of turning your garden waste into mulch that's far better than any you'll find anywhere else. Now just note, this is for composting garden waste, not food waste, but I am making a course on composting food waste as we speak. So if you're not on my email list, make sure you join it and I'll let you know when that's available. So throughout the year you accumulate as much garden waste as possible. You need at least 1 metre cubed, ideally more. If you only have a small garden, you can accumulate it over several years. Now you chop it up nice and fine and mix it with grass clippings and pile it up. Overnight it's going to heat up rapidly to around 70 or 80 degrees Celsius. But after a couple of weeks, the microbes which are breaking it down are going to run out of air, so you need to turn it. Now for the first 2 or 3 turns you can add more grass clippings, and we're going to be turning it around 5 times in total every 2 weeks. Now after the 5th turn, you put a tarpaulin over it to stop the weed seeds from landing on it, and you leave it to mature for a few months before spreading it on your beds. So that was a really quick look at composting, but earlier this week I actually made a longer video that shows you the exact process that I use at home, so make sure you check it out on my website. So plants, as you know, are the main players in building soil health. We often think that healthy soil leads to healthy plants, but in reality it's the other way around. But to build soil health, we need lots of plants to cover the whole of the soil surface and to feed the whole of the soil. However, to get good initial planting density, you're looking at around £800 to £1,000 for the same 25 metre squared bed that we just mulched. Again, this is too much money to spend for most home gardeners. Thankfully, we can make plants at home for free. This is called propagation, and to many people, propagation is seen as a bit of a secret art. It can seem a bit daunting, because you hear about all these different ways of propagating plants, layering, budding, side veneer grafting, and so on. Now, I haven't got time to show you in this talk how to propagate in great detail, although I am working on an online course for this, so again, if you're not on the email list, join it and I'll let you know when that's available. But right now, I want to tell you that propagation is easier than you might think, and while there may be hundreds of ways to grow plants from scratch, you only really need to know 3 of them. Now these 3 methods of propagation are responsible for the vast majority of plants grown in nurseries. The first is seed sowing. It's best done in autumn and early winter, as the cold weather helps your seeds to germinate in spring. Now, you can save seed from your own garden, which is completely free and amazing to do, but if you can get permission to save seed from other people's gardens, that helps you to build diversity in your garden. Of course, you can buy affordable seed online, and that's another great way to build biodiversity. I like Chiltern seeds for this, as they've got a really good range. The second way is from cuttings. Cuttings are a really quick and easy way to make more plants. These are most commonly taken in spring and late summer from non-flowering plant growth, and will give you an exact clone of your favourite plants. They're especially useful for growing plants that only have one growth point from the base, and therefore can't be divided. And that brings me on to the third and final method, which is division. This works amazingly well with clump-forming herbaceous plants. It's done from autumn through to spring, and has the added advantage of creating big plants quickly. So these are the only methods of propagation you need to know to fill your garden to the brim with a diverse range of plants for a fraction of the price of buying them. And although it seems a bit daunting to begin with, it's no more complicated than learning to bake 3 different types of bread, a loaf, a pizza and a flatbread. And to really push you to give this a go, I wanted to tell you that last year between August and September, I propagated around £4,000 worth of plants from cuttings in our small home greenhouse, and these were ready to plant out in April. That's the same amount of money that I spent on my van. So this really is one of the most valuable skills you can learn for boosting biodiversity in your garden, so give it a go. Okay, this last action is quite different from the rest. It's probably the most important action of all, and it's also the one that I have the most difficulty speaking about because it's not so much about plants and gardens and ecosystems, which I'm very comfortable talking about. It's about people and our connection with the natural world. So if we are to build a patchwork of wildlife-friendly gardens that covers as big an area as possible, we need to act not only in our own gardens, we need to inspire other people to do so in theirs. Because at times, it feels like there's not a lot of positive inspiration out there for gardeners. Amy went to a garden centre recently and she sent me this photo. Enjoy an insect-free summer. Now when someone decides they want to learn how to garden, this is what they're faced with. Poison, fake grass, mypex, tools that snap the first time you use them, plastic netting. This is why we need to inspire. This is why we need to give guidance, why we need to give reassurance, because our connection with the natural world has been pushed to breaking point by the faceless corporations that force this sort of rubbish and the ideas that come with it into garden centres, and actually into our lives in general. We need to inspire now more than ever because our wildlife is fast approaching tipping points that we can't afford to reach. But despite that, I still feel really positive. I went to Wisley this year for the first time since I left in 2018, and I was really happy to see that their gardening style has changed dramatically. More and more of the garden is adopting a naturalistic style that supports wildlife and builds soil health and ecosystem resilience. And it's increasingly common to see deadwood being left in place, like this old tree trunk which you can see by these holes is being used by saproxylic insects. Large areas of lawn that don't need to be walked on are being managed much more softly, which again provides habitats, food sources, it locks carbon into the soil, and so much more. Now the high priority areas often have bulbs planted into them like this, and areas that get less visitors like the arboretum are simply left to grow long over summer. Now this might seem like a small change to an outsider, but when I worked for the RHS, the arboretum was mown every 2 weeks in summer, and as a result was ecologically, I'll say, lacking. So seeing this new style of gardening taking off is a really big step in the right direction, especially when you consider that the RHS gardens receive over 3 million visitors each year. So people are seeing this, they're being exposed to new ways of doing things, and they're realising that it's okay not to have a perfectly manicured lawn. It's okay to leave deadwood in your garden. They're learning to mimic nature. But we need to amplify this message because there are competing narratives out there. We need to be the supportive voice when gardeners have moments of doubt, to reassure them when their neighbour calls their new wildflower meadow messy, to tell gardeners that what they're doing is amazing and that our collective, small-scale efforts can add up to something big. So what do you do when you get home? Well, you might already be doing some of these actions, and if you are, that's amazing. But can you expand on some of them? Can you make your wildflower meadow bigger? Can you increase the planting density or the diversity in your naturalistic borders? But then again, maybe you're not doing any of these, maybe you're completely new to gardening, and that's also great because it means that you get to choose where you start. Pick one of the first 3. Don't worry about making mistakes, I believe in you. This time next year, your garden could be a very different place. Thanks.